Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio. Hello and happy Friday. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
Oh, Harriet.
Yeah.
I confessed to Tracy before we started talking about Harriet that every time I hear that name, I think of So I Married an Axe Murderer.
Yeah.
So if you, like me, think she's going to be a hard-hearted harbinger of haggis, she's not.
Okay.
There's so much to unpack with her. And I know you got real irritated about this sort of flip that she did where it made it seem like she was saying, like, I was disabled and now I'm not.
Right.
There's a whole other read on her illness, though.
Okay, go. You go first.
That we didn't mention in the episode that may or may not shift how you think about it. But I only found one person really writing about it in this way. So I didn't want to put it in the episode as though it was factual, but it's an interesting take. So, and it's that that biography that we mentioned in the magazine biography. That writer looked at all of Harriet's personal writings and kind of came to the conclusion that she wasn't sure she had actually had a spinal injury so much as she may have fallen into that thing that happened to a lot of women during the time, where if you exhibited any kind of, sign of not feeling great, they kind of lumped you under like hysterical.
Right.
And that you were just a frail woman who had problems because you were inherently nervous due to being a woman. And that would have even impacted, kids at that point. So it's unclear.
Yeah. Well, and it's like, that's one of the things that can be so challenging to talk about. Things like chronic illnesses and disability with people who were living, even more recently. But like, so often the terms that were used to describe what was going on with people were really vague, and they could encapsulate a lot of things. And like somebody who really was just like bored and stifled in an unhappy marriage might be described as being mentally ill or disabled or whatever. And like that might not at all be what was going on. That can make it really hard to talk about it. But I just, as I was reading it, I was like, I want to say really clearly that this does not mean that somebody who is disabled or has a chronic illness just isn't trying hard enough and they put their mind to it. If they put their mind to it, they could get better, because man, not only is that false, it harms so many people so much.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to read that quote that's like, it seems like when she was no longer married, she was no longer ill.
It was fine then.
Because it didn't seem like it was so much. And that same writer even kind of makes the case that Harriet and Charles may have had some interlocking just unhappiness that they manifested. Like, instead of saying, I'm actually unfulfilled and not happy in marriage, it was like, I must be sick.
Yeah.
Because, that happens, right? Two people can love each other, and that doesn't mean their marriage is healthy or good.
Right.
And I think that feels like the case here. Again, it's retroactive, and we only have some of the letters because he burned them. He also burned all of his letters and wrote a note about it that was like, I don't want any of my life on record. But it does, as you said, it becomes very hard to unpick it all, and it's very, very weird. And it is, she none of that comes up at all in her later life, except that like the only time she ever mentioned it in interviews was to say like, oh, well, when I was a kid, I had spinal problems, and that's how I learned so much stuff. I was an autodidact. I was reading all the time.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a cool thing. We don't know if that's even true.
Right.
And I will say the same problem comes up. I only saw it fleetingly because she was not the focus of a lot of discussion related to her mother, where, when the family moved from Buffalo to California pretty abruptly, most biographies about Harriet suggest that her father was, seeking financial benefit or like a business opportunity. But there was at least one I saw that was like, well, her mother was delicate and needed Western air. And I'm like, Huh.
Yeah.
We don't know. It makes it so hard. The other thing that may or may not mitigate your feelings of frustration with her over it is the fact that I think part of the impetus for her to hide that kind of ties back to everything she said constantly about how, like, no, if I'm going to do business with men, I have to be 10 times better than them at everything. I think she actually says 4 times, but I think she probably held some concern that if she let any kind of information that she may have had any kind of weakness leak out, that it would give people that wanted to maybe downplay her business acumen ammunition to do so.
Sure.
I think that's really probably the biggest reason.
Yeah.
Yes, it still has the unfortunate repercussion of, like,
Yeah.
I'm no longer ill. I just decided to not be ill. But
Well, there are also things that we can't really know conclusively. Like,
right.
did she have conditions that as she grew older, she found better ways to deal with? Or was it just like, was she concealing information? Or like, there are lots of different...
Or was she one of the 75% of women who were deemed ill through hysteria that really were just being human?
Yeah. When something else was going on, or maybe nothing was going on, and she was just branded that way.
Yeah, because she had all of those letters burnt.
Right.
That would have been a really handy resource to piece things together.
Yeah.
We'll never know. I do love that she figured out the pampas grass thing.
Yeah.
Because the reason normally people will grow, if they're growing a walnut orchard, they'll grow something like corn in between the trees. And the reason is, like, when we say it's a support crop, what it really is that those things grow much faster and can be turned into a sellable good.
Okay.
Much faster than, like, a walnut tree from a seedling can actually produce anything viable. And so while you're waiting on the bigger and potentially more profitable walnut crop to come to maturity and fruition, you can be planting things in the interim that are like a few months flip over.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was unusual that she went with pampas grass instead of corn, because that's what most people would have done. But she was like, no, I got another idea, which I think is very interesting. Like, I love that part of her story where she's like, I'm going to crack the code on this whole farming and ranching thing.
Yeah.
And I'm going to figure out how to do it and make this work, even on this property that seems to have problems. And she did. And that I love about her. And of course, it's, to me, super admirable. But then it gets that thing where I do feel like she started to reach that point where she thought her every idea was really good.
Mm-hmm.
And why aren't people listening to me?
Yeah. I like the idea of being like, all right, can we figure out a way to control these floodwaters?
Yes.
Can we figure out a way to reuse the wastewater? Not as much of a fan of let's build a dam.
Right. I mean, there are so many repercussions, and part of the reason we don't get into them is they're huge, right? Like, there are wildlife repercussions. There are repercussions to the indigenous people that live in those places that in many cases are not being consulted about whether a dam should go there.
Yeah, the United States went through kind of a heyday of dam building. Not necessarily stuff as big as Hoover Dam, that's its whole own other story. But like, there are a lot of much smaller dams. A lot of them at this point are aging and unsafe, and a lot of them, to a greater or lesser extent, like flooded land that was supposed to be the land that indigenous people were still allowed to use. And in more recent years, there has been an effort to like safely dismantle a lot of these dams and sort of like do it in a way that's not going to just cause a massive flood downstream.
Yeah.
And so, like, I don't know, this is like adds to the many things with her that I'm like, man, I have thoughts and then I have other thoughts about you.
I mean, it's really interesting because she did in many ways make that area of California livable.
Mm-hmm.
Like, her ideas led to a lot of livability there. In terms of, just the crops even, like being able to figure out how to do that. And I feel like if she had focused more on teaching other ranchers how to like put together their own water pumps and stuff instead of being like, let's build a massive thing. It's
Right.
I would be like, yeah, okay. But as she said, it gets into a whole other ball of wax.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Harriet.
Yeah. I feel like we're going to get emails who are mad that I am sort of judging somebody by modern standards. And I'm like, it's more like thinking about the legacy and impact of decisions that people have made in the past that we're still living with today.
Yeah, and I mean, I will say, right, she ultimately was not the one who made those decisions.
Sure,
She advocated for it, but was it? And I know a lot of people really love Harriet. And I think she is completely fascinating as a really ingenious person. Like I love that she came up with a way to open and close windows from bed. I'm like, that's pretty cool. It's really, like a telescoping stick.
Yeah.
I like the idea that she was so driven in those early years of being a widow where she was like, how am I going to make money? And she kind of was like doing I have a million good ideas. I'm very smart, like a scattershot approach of like, I will innovate in the following 4 things. Like I see why people love her, but then there's like that thing of like, she hates people that aren't white settlers. Okay, that's a problem. Yeah. I don't know. If she had continued to age, who knows how she would have, potentially shifted again in her most mature years.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, Harriet. Are you an Olympics watcher, Tracy?
Not really.
No?
Like there are some events that I really do enjoy watching. In the winter, I enjoy the figure skating. In the summer, I enjoy the gymnastics. There's a lot of other stuff happening at the Olympics that I don't really care about. There's been so many changes over the years to how one watches the Olympics.
Yes.
Going from you turn the television on and they're on there to like figuring out where do I watch the Olympics now?
Yes.
It's not something I love enough to put that effort into it, but often I will hear about some amazing performance somebody did and I'll go watch, the like official video on YouTube or whatever if that exists. How about you?
I love the Olympics.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I'm the opposite of you. I will figure out how to watch it, and it doesn't matter if it's a sport that I'm into or not. I will watch it. I have such a great memory of the olden times of our working together when we first started as employees of Discovery, when our company was part of that, having 3 days a week where we could telework.
Oh, yeah.
Because that meant that I could watch the Olympics the whole time I was working during the day. Like I was working, but I had the Olympics on in the background constantly. And to me, that was the most fun. And I don't know why I get so into it because I'm not into a lot of the sports. But I get completely fished into the whole thing. I want to watch all of the interviews with athletes. I want all of the human interest stories. I want all of the things.
And I feel like we've talked, I don't remember if it was on this show or if it was on the other podcast we used to be on, which I'm not even going to name because I don't encourage anybody to go listen to that at this point.
I don't even know if you could find it anywhere.
Yeah. I feel like things said extemporaneously well over a decade ago, we just don't need to go back to that. But we did have a conversation about how there was a time, it might have been on this show, it might have been on that one. There was a time when the Olympics were really struggling in terms of getting anybody to watch them.
Yeah.
And adding in that focus on the athletes and the human interest stories around the athletes like really brought a lot of renewed attention to it in a time when a lot of people just did not really care that much.
Yeah, because they couldn't connect to it, right? Like,
Yeah.
I feel like for a lot of people, when you're watching, if you're not into a specific sport anyway, the idea of watching someone whose entire life is about very high level performance
Uh-huh.
is just hard to like get into from a viewer's perspective, right? Where it's like, I don't know, curling, I don't know about that.
Mhm.
Curling, which has vanished for a bit. I don't know if it's coming
Oh,
back or
has
not.
it? I don't even know.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to me and smart that someone on the broadcast side was like, you know what we need to do?
Mhm.
Start interviewing athletes. Because you do realize, like, yes, these are people that are very driven and they work very, very hard, but they're also people.
Mhm.
And that is always helpful to remember. They're not just machines that go fast or jump high or whatnot. They also have thoughts and feelings and are completely fully rounded individuals
Right.
that have lives that expand far beyond their Olympic careers. Love it. Man, I will watch gymnastics all day, every day.
I do like to watch gymnastics, and I do like to watch figure skating.
I have a gymnastics thing that I'm scared will make people angry with me.
Okay.
There is an aspect to gymnastics that I struggle with. Aside from the scandals of it, completely aside.
Right.
Obviously, there have been some horrible scandals, and that we should all be struggling with. Just from an aesthetic point of view.
Uh-huh.
Because I grew up a bunhead taking ballet.
Yeah.
It breaks my brain to watch gymnasts point their toes.
Yeah.
Because they don't do it the way you would in ballet. And to me, it just looks wrong. They're doing great. I'm not actually criticizing them.
Yeah.
I'm saying to me, like, the aesthetic of it, I'm like, that is not how a foot should look when it is pointed. That is not nearly pretty enough. And it is. It's perfectly fine.
Right.
But I just am like, don't do that. Just don't do that. It's totally my hang up.
Yeah.
That is actually a segue to talking about when I was heavily in my ballet zone when I was much younger, and they introduced, I think it was 84, rhythmic gymnastics.
Oh, I remember the rhythmic gymnastics
because I
introduction.
remember a lot of people in the dance community being like, I think I could do that.
Yeah.
And it being sort of a really exciting idea. And it is very pretty.
Yeah.
I have a whole other thing that it might be its own episode one day.
Okay.
Did you know, you probably knew, that for a while you could do art and get an Olympic medal?
I do remember we had a talk about this at one point.
Yeah. I love that idea in some ways, and in others I hate it.
Mm-hmm.
So I've never really gotten deep into the thing because I'm like, art is subjective. There's no such thing as objectively good art, in my opinion, or objectively bad art, unless it hurts someone. But I'm fascinated by the idea. I love it. Like I said, I love it in some ways. And we've certainly talked about many other instances of like art competitions, but I get really hung up about it.
Yeah. Have I ever told you about my extremely brief time taking gymnastics?
No.
Okay. I would have been maybe 5 or 6. Like this, I was elementary school age for sure. And I don't remember exactly what led to me taking gymnastics. But as a child, I was very, very scared of heights.
Okay.
And this included being on the balance beam that was not on the floor.
The balance beam terrified me as a kid and still would.
Also, for all of my life, I have had very, very tight hamstrings. And the only time I have had like a reasonable level of flexibility in my hamstrings was when I was in a drum and bugle corps in high school. And that involved like just relentless daily stretching and effort.
Yeah.
And so like as a kid, I'm trying to take gymnastics classes and I literally can't touch my toes. And then thing number 3 is I just could never manage to do a cartwheel or any other cartwheel-like things. I just couldn't do it. Part of like throwing my head at the ground from I couldn't
get over
ever.
the hump.
I couldn't get over that. And there were people that like compassionate and thoughtful gymnastics instructors who worked with me a whole lot to try to like get me to be able to do this. And I never could do it. And I have never done a cartwheel or a round off or whatever in my whole life.
See, that is one of the few things I've retained.
Yeah.
I can still bust out a cartwheel.
Yeah.
Now, if I overthink it, I'll mess it up. But
right. Not me.
I can still do a cartwheel.
Similarly, it took me an incredibly long time to dive into a swimming pool.
I cannot do that.
I don't think I ever managed to like dive into the swimming pool in a leaping kind of way, but I could kneel on the diving board and get into the water head first that way.
Oh. Yeah, I can't dive.
I sort of feel like if I tried to do any of this now at the age of 49 with no preparation, it would not go well for me.
But can you hurtle yourself into the water and just go for a minute and see how far you go?
Maybe.
We didn't read those press accounts of the plunge for distance because they are very unkind to the athletes.
Right.
And like a lot of body shaming involved.
Yeah. That's part of what I struggle with about sports like gymnastics and figure skating and stuff. There's so much body stuff involved in all of that. And
yeah.
having been in a drum and bugle corps, which is way less intensive than doing like gymnastics at a competitive level for your whole life. Like I still have a lot of mixed feelings about my time in drum corps and continuing to march and practice while injured and stuff like that. And a lot of that applies to various Olympic sports also, especially sports that like really young people are the ones competing.
Yeah. I feel like, I am no expert, but I do feel like that has changed in some ways.
Yeah.
In a lot of sports where people will there is less of an impetus and a drive to like, no, you push through injury and you keep going. Like, I think sports medicine has advanced so much in our lifetimes that there's just a realization of like, hey, don't do that. Like, you got to think longer term than this. So, and I know there are still athletes that compete while injured. I'm not trying to say that doesn't happen anymore, but I do think fewer athletes maybe are pressured to do so. It probably depends on their team and their coach and their sport.
And their parents in some cases.
Yes. And then, yeah. But I like the Olympics just fine. Were you weren't in Atlanta when the Olympics were here?
What year was that? 1990? No, I was not. I was in college.
That was wild.
Yeah.
That is the one and only time I have lived in an Olympic city.
Mm-hmm.
And it was bananas. Because
there was a proposal to have the Olympics in Boston a few years ago. Yeah. And Boston said, no, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's very expensive. It's often, my understanding is it's a net loss fiscally for the city.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a thing you do for clout and not a whole lot else. And then you're often left with an aftermath that is really rough.
Yeah. I don't know how much truth there is to this, but I do know the Atlanta Olympics, a lot of people pinpoint as like a moment when Atlanta got a lot sprawlier and a lot busier in a way that seemed accelerated by like
I don't know that I would say it got sprawlier. It's always been real sprawly.
Mm-hmm.
But I do mark it as a moment of like sea change for the city, because I remember when I came to Atlanta for college in the very end of the 80s, it was a city of like 1 million people.
Mm-hmm.
It was great. And this isn't like a negative on population density, but in terms of what the city could support, in terms of infrastructure, housing, etc., that was a good number at the time. And then after the Olympics, it was 4 million. And like a lot of that happened very quickly. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't, like, even though they had done a lot of infrastructure work, to be ready for the Olympics, it wasn't enough for a fourfold increase in
Right. Yeah.
population. And it's not like those people all moved in on one day. It's, it took some time, but still it was very quick. And I just feel like that is really when Atlanta traffic got its reputation of craziness, just being so jam-packed all the time.
Yeah.
Um,
If I'm remembering rightly, I moved there in 2003. So
right.
I only saw post Olympics Atlanta.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was an interesting thing to watch it change. I mean, that's also a year that's meaningful to me just in general, because I met my husband that year and we got married that year, and like we went to a couple of Olympic events. We went to a baseball game, I think 2 baseball games. And it was in some ways really fun. Like there were some interesting choices that I feel like were smart in terms of preparation, right? Like we worked with some like I had anything to do with it. The city worked with some universities where they basically like subsidized the building out of modern dormitories that were used for athletes, and then became part of the university campus. And some of those schools really needed that kind of upgrade, and that was great for them. But it did. I mean, that corridor right through it, downtown Atlanta just got clogged at a level that has never not been that again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The last time I was there was for when we closed our union bargaining, got our contract. I don't know if we've said that specifically on the podcast, but I was having to take a Lyft to the airport to go back home.
Mm-hmm.
And I had kind of forgotten what a bad traffic day can be like.
Oh, yeah.
And this was, not a time that I know the span of time you would describe as rush hour in Atlanta is very broad, but like
fluid.
This was not a time of day that I would have expected to be particularly bad in terms of traffic. And it was like, we got onto the highway and then we just stopped. And I was like, I'm so glad I left with lots of extra time to get to the airport.
Yeah, I always do. I mean, we have a route that doesn't go through downtown if downtown is clogged, and we can usually get to the airport fast, but it's like if we can't, we really can't.
Yeah.
And so I always leave super early, and if I get to the airport early, great. I have my favorite restaurant. I go get a meal, and if we don't, we're usually still fine on time.
Yeah. Yeah. I had come from the airport on MARTA because the hotel that we were staying at was at Peachtree Center.
Yeah.
But then like that's not where I was leaving from to get back to the airport, and I was not near MARTA anymore.
Well, and the rail to the airport, like those stations have been weird.
Mm-hmm.
And getting I don't know if you walked by them while you were there, but the stations at the airport, one of them was one part of it was shut down completely for a while. Like that's been all a little bit trickier.
Yeah. It was not a problem getting to the hotel, so that part worked out.
Great. It might have been back up and running by then, but I remember there was some time earlier this year where I was like, can the train come into the airport? And I'm not sure that it could all the time, which I'm sure was very problematic for a lot of people. But yeah, Atlanta was definitely very changed by the Olympic Games.
Yeah.
And I remember having a friend who lived in LA when the games were there, and him being like, oh, it was disastrous afterwards, because then it was just like a mess.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember feeling quite like that about Atlanta. I'm sure some people do have stories like that, but I do remember just noting how different it was.
Yeah.
Because I had lived here like 7 years at that point. So I had a pretty good. Anyway, Olympics. I'll be watching.
Okay.
We didn't mention it in the episode, but of course the Olympics we were talking about, which were in the early phase of the modern Olympic Games, there weren't separate winter and summers yet.
Right. I remember when that change happened.
1920s, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when that change happened and it being very controversial, and there were
no, I mean they didn't split winter and summer at all. There was only summer.
Oh, yes.
Until I think 1928. I'm going by memory, so if I'm wrong, apologies. But then when they split years, that was a different thing that we were around for.
Yeah.
And yes, it was very controversial. But now, here we are. We're all used to it. If you have a weekend coming up, I hope it's delightful. And if you can do a cartwheel and it's fun, do some. If you can't, find something else to do that's fun. Play mind games like chess that can't be part of the Olympics. If you don't have time off, I still hope that you have fun and do something delightful and that everyone is super cool to you. We will be right back here tomorrow with a classic episode and then on Monday with a brand new one.
Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.